Alright, so I have this floor object over here. I'm going to start texturing it and adding what areas on it afterwards. So the first thing I'm going to do is start dragging all these textures that I need. So I've chosen concrete, plain concrete kind of a texture over here. And I'm start dragging the diffuse, the roughness, and the normal map. So all these three maps are the essential parts of a material, and I'm going to start connecting them to their respective slots. And if you are downloading textures online, it's essential that you just keep to the three basic maps. If you want to add more detail to it, you can apply the ambient occlusion map, or also the bump map. But these three maps should suffice for most cases, and especially if you're blending materials, it can pile up into lots of textures, and especially in a Mac, it's gonna be memory intensive, and it won't let you use a lot of textures. So right now I'm just gonna change the mapping on this texture so that it maps correctly onto the surface that I have here. I'm changing the projection type to box so that it will project on all sides, the top, the front, and the sides, so that even if I don't have UV mapping on my model, it's still going to project just fine. And this is good for models that are like floors, walls, big road and stuff, where you don't have a UV map, you just going to project it on all sides. So I changed the texture coordinate to object so that it will map correctly, and change the texture projection type from flat to box there. And then now the texture is tiled well, but it's very tiny, so I'm just gonna resize it to, in the scale of the mapping node, I set the XY to 0.5 both, so that I can see the granularity of the little pebbles in that texture. So the next thing I'm going to do is adjust the normal map settings, because I want to see the effect of that normal map. I want to have those undulations on the surface. So I'm just going to adjust that first. So I find that increasing the intensity of this normal map gives it a little bit more detail, because the intensity of this normal map is not that high. And also I changed the HDRIs so that I can see the surface much better and the way it interacts with my normal map, because if sometimes certain HDRIs won't let you see the surface much clearly. So I'm looking for an HDRI that has a bit more contrast, that I can see the surface much better. Alright, so you can see that I changed the contrast of the normal map there to see that undulation on the surface much better. So changing the intensity. And unplugging the base color so that I can see the effect of only the normal map and the roughness map on my surface. And sometimes I like to test out normal maps if their green channel is inverted, and this is especially useful if you downloaded your normal maps online. So what I do is I create a separate RGB node and a combined RGB node, and then I connect both the R and the blue channels to the respective channels, and then for the green channel I invert it using the invert node and plug it into the green channel of the combined RGB node, and I plug that combined RGB node to the normal map and my normal map to the separate RGB node, so that this inverts the green channel and lets me see if, because if you download your textures online, some normal maps have their green channels inverted, so you're gonna have to invert the green channel in Blender. So that's why I inverted the green channel in here in the shading nodes, to see if it needs to be inverted, because some textures, some normal maps online are in a different format and their green channels are inverted. So here I'm just testing which is looking correct, the inverted green channel or the normal one. So here I'm comparing it to the diffuse map. If I can distinguish the pebbles, how what they look like in the normal map. So it seems that I didn't need to invert the green channel, so I didn't really need to do that, but it's good to check always, because if you downloaded your textures online, chances are there might be textures that have their normal map inverted in the green channel, so you might have to check, and because it might not look correct on your surface. All right. So it's all looking correctly. Alright, so turns out I didn't need to invert that green channel anymore, because it was working fine. So now I'm gonna arrange my nodes so that I can add the nodes for the next process, which is adding the wet areas in this on this surface. So it's important to have your nodes arranged properly so that you don't get confused while you're working. Alright, so the next thing that I do is add 3 mix RGB nodes, and I do this by just duplicating the first one that I created and then connecting them to the nodes for the textures that I have, the diffuse, roughness, and the normal map. So I connect them all to color 1, and I just leave the setting for the blending to mix, because we're going to use a texture for the factor of our blending. So next is I'm going to add a noise texture, and this gives me the ability to just generate a mask for my wet and my dry areas very quickly without having to paint it, because our surface doesn't have a UV map, so I can't really paint on it, so it's much better if I use a noise texture. But of course you can also use a painted mask if you have a UV for your plane, which is very easy to create because this is just a plane. So I added a color ramp node to the noise texture so that I can adjust the contrast of this texture because it's a little too smooth, so that I get those hard edges that I'm looking for, and also great separation between the black and white areas. So the white areas will be the wet areas and the black areas will be the dry areas. And also I plugged in the vector node, plugged in the texture coordinate node, so from just using the object coordinate for the vector for the noise texture. So I'm just adjusting the settings for the noise texture. I'm just adjusting the scale settings, and also maybe the detail settings later on if I need more detail onto those edges. So just using a bigger scale so that I can define those wet areas to be like, big areas. Alright, so now I'm going to use this color ramp node, or rather the color ramped noise texture, and plug it into the factor slot for each individual mix node. And right away you can see how it mixes those textures. So right now everything is all those color 2 slots are white, so it doesn't look correct, so we're gonna have to change that. Alright, so for the diffuse, if you look at wet areas and the way they're covering a surface, they mostly appear darker than the actual surface. So the wet areas appear darker than the actual surface, the dry surface that they're in. So right now this color is set to white. So I want to use the texture that I have for the diffuse, or the albedo, or the base color. So I'm gonna use a hue saturation node and plug my diffuse color node to the color, and then adjust the value and turn it down a little bit so that it makes the texture darker. And then I plug this node to color 2 so that those wet areas are going to appear like a dark version of that texture. So you can see now it looks like those are wet areas compared to the other areas. So you can also adjust the value there. So just, if you want it to be just a little darker or much darker. And then afterwards, the next thing, the most important thing to make something look wet is the roughness map. So for the roughness map, we can add the same thing, make this roughness map darker, or we can just use a simple color. In this case, I just use a simple color because I don't want to utilize the roughness map. So in here, for color 2, we'll just drag it down all the way down to something very low. Maybe not like completely black, but something that is very black, very dark, so that it makes it look like very wet and shiny. Now the thing that's making this bumpy is because of the normal map. So what we're going to do is make the normal map in those areas less rough, or don't have detail in the normal map. So what we're going to do is delete this normal map right over here, and then create another normal map node and plug our texture over into it and plug it to color 1. And then we're going to create another normal map node, but in this case we are going to make this second normal map node have lesser strength. So in this case I set it to a really low value, like 0.02, and then I plug the same normal map to that normal map node. So I plug the mix RGB node back to the normal, and then I increase the strength of the main normal map to get back that strength on the dry surfaces, and then plug my normal map again to the second normal map node, and then plug it to color 2, and then again you get that same normal map in the wet areas, but in this case we're going to lower down the intensity or the strength of that normal map. So I'm going to set it to something like 0.02, just to 0.01 or 0.02, just to get a little bit of a detail in those like wet areas, but not like very bumpy, because then it wouldn't look like it's water anymore. So now you have wet areas on your surface, and this is just using a noise texture as a factor. for the blending. And you can check those areas if your edges are sharp enough, because you don't want those edges to be like blurry or blended between the dry and wet areas. You want it to be distinct between dry and wet areas, but not too sharp, because then it wouldn't look like it's, those edge areas are transitioning from dry to wet. So here you can see me adjusting the normal map and the second normal map for the wet areas, and turning it back down so that it doesn't look bumpy. It makes it look like it's water. And you can go back and adjust the scaling of your noise texture so that you can adjust the placement of those wet areas. And if you want, you can also create an independent mapping node for your noise texture, so that you can adjust the location of those puddles there. So all you have to do is create a different texture coordinate node and mapping coordinate node and plug it to the noise texture vector, so that you can control that independently without affecting the other textures. So in here, just testing the look of those wet surfaces using the HDRI, seeing what it looks like. So now, since those wet areas have the roughness set to a really low value, they start reflecting the environment, and that's what water does. It starts to reflect the environment. So now I just rearrange my nodes so that I can see this much better. I put the texture node that I use for mixing the noise texture that I use for mixing up top, so that I can group the main textures that I'm using down here, so that I can understand which goes where. Alright, and then the beauty of this thing is that we can, of this node tree, is that we can change our textures into a completely different set of textures without disrupting our material arrangement, our node tree. So I selected a different kind of texture, so I decided that I didn't like that texture that I was using, so I use a different color map. And right away, even though I'm using a different color map or roughness map and normal map, I change it to a different kind of set, it will still look fine, because our node setup is dependent on those textures themselves to create the look of those wet areas. So our wet areas is utilizing also a darker version of that texture, the diffuse map, and then for the roughness it's using an independent color, and then for the normal map it's just using the same normal map, but strength is set to a very low value, so you can use any texture set that you want, and then just changing the scale of the mapping so that right now it looks much better. It looks like it's not too big, the grains are not too big. So just like that, just by changing those three textures, you can change the look of the surface without harming your wet areas, without having to set up the surface, the shader nodes, all over again. And so this is your shader tree, shader node tree. So you have at the top, you have your texture, noise texture, plug into a color ramp to make it look sharp and contrasty, distinguish the black and white areas much better, and plug it into the 3 mix nodes which drive which areas are going to be wet.